You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news, or at least some of the latest news in the industry. I don't think we can cover all of it. There's too much going on. I'm Josh Schimmer. My co-hosts today are Eric Schmidt, Paul Matteis, and Yaron Werber. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, in addition to our disclosures, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. Can probably speak for all of us when I say wouldn't shouldn't construe our discussion for as investment advice. Investing in biotech companies is obviously not without risk, a lesson many of us have been learning lately. Also, I think I speak for many of us when I say I want to quickly offer our prayers for the world, for the peace-loving people in Israel, Iran, the Middle East, the United States, and beyond in these very tumultuous, quite unprecedented times. We've got a sell side analyst sweep here. What an honor for me to host some of the best in the business here, as well as Eric, who's actually the legend of all of us and can actually proudly claim both me and Yaron as his disciples. So I think, Paul, it might be three against one. You're really gonna have to bring it. All right,
Sounds good.
let's start off. Biotech state of affairs. Love to get everyone's thoughts, general sentiments. Are we finally at a bottom? We keep asking if we're at the bottom. Is this it? All right, let's start with who's optimistic from here.
I am. I think. I mean, I feel like so far, right? I mean, I assume everybody here saw that Bloomberg article and it's probably covered elsewhere. Actually, it was covered widely, right? Because a reporter asked Trump around the trader phrase taco, right? Trump always chickens out. That being the joke that as a trader you should be buying dips on tariffs and any macro news because things sort of alleviate. I mean, at least in my conversations with investors, I think there's a growing school of thought that therapeutics has played out the same way, right? I mean, you probably should have bought the dip when RFK was first appointed. That's a stock comment, not a political world public health comment, but that's potentially the reality, right? I mean, same when Peter Marks was dismissed from the FDA. Same on the tariff day. So I think, I mean, we're going to talk about MFN, and I think my only point of caution is a few of the CEOs I've talked to in my coverage universe who are very involved in pharma. They're more worried than the average investor. I mean, I think they're coming from the place that like pharma's not going to get out totally unscathed, right? Like some concession has to be made, but I mean, it feels like things are improving, right? I mean, it feels like the FDA is really open for business. We've seen companies without a buyer successfully launch drugs really, really well. We've seen some small companies be able, like micros, be able to recapitalize themselves. We've seen M&A, right, with premiums that are more modest, which I interpret as a good sign that, maybe we're actually seeing mid-cap companies as more willing, realistic sellers. So I feel like there's a lot to like, even if MFN is still the boogeyman. I'd be curious what others think.
All right, Eric, you're on.
I like
Well,
it, Paul. I like it though.
yeah,
I like
I'm not
how
sure I
quickly
can
you
be.
jumped in.
Yeah, so I'm not as brave as Paul. There's no way I'm going to go all in on biotech, but what he says certainly resonates, and I think I'd add on that we're just seeing good fundamental news flow. We had a bunch of conferences this week, whether it was EULAR or EHA or ERA that had ended up last week, and the data sets coming from those meetings is really favorable. We had an FDA approval, as Paul kind of alluded to, that no one expected to happen this week, that was kind of surprise approval. So that was great. We've got study results even outside the medical meetings that continue to pile up in a positive way. This had to be, maybe even coming off of last week and ASCO, the best maybe 2 week string of events that we've seen in the industry in a long, long time, at least, in my recent memory. I can't think of a better 2 week stint for fundamental news flow. So at the end of the day, that's what's got to drive it, right? We can't just hope that investors are going to bid up these stocks based on nothing. There has to be fundamental progress to support. And yeah, I'm pretty pleased with how things have progressed on that front. Yaron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. So, Paul, I totally agree. I'm probably maybe a little bit between both of you. I think we've hit the bottom, and so I really like the turn here. The valuations are stretched to the downside. Expectations were as bad as it gets. Biotech is probably not going to go into a bull market. There's no bull structural thesis here, but the news flow are good. We've had a lot of positive data. I think we're going to talk about some of them. We're seeing M&A sentiment's only going to get better. We don't think MFN is going to go through. And there's some positive movement, at least from both what Prasad is saying and Makari. So yeah, we're constructive. I would say we're constructive, probably not bullish.
Anyone think there's another leg down with MFN, or that's generally incorporated into sentiment?
It feels like there are specific stocks that, like, depending on how this looks, could be more or less hit. I mean, I think I mean, if unless you think it's a broad impact to the sector where we're talking about disaster scenario, all drugs, I feel like there's definitely fears priced in, and like people are maybe on the sidelines of certain names or don't want to go more overweight. So I feel like there's some priced in, but like the single stock impact to me is still kind of the wild card here. Like for example, look, I cover Alnylam. I'm very bullish on Invutra. Like that's not a counter consensus take. We'll see. Like that. Like what if MFN is centers around Part B drugs, right? I mean that like suddenly, Alnylam is trading close to all time highs. By the way, I'm not sounding the alarms on Alnylam at all. I have no edge in this. I don't know if it's gonna center around Part B or not. But I do think that there are like nuanced scenarios with MFN where certain stocks could get hit more than others, and I think like that is probably priced in across the sector in the XBI, but like, the single stock impact, like there's a range of outcomes.
Do you all think, as sell side analysts who generally have a predilection in biotech, just because I think it's often easier to spot those undervalued assets, that we have a skewed perspective of the index because we kind of cherry pick our coverage universes, and in doing so tend to align ourselves with those companies that we think are, most undervalued, and that's fine, right? Like we don't need the entire XBI to go up, right? As long as we have a good, strong collection of names that really are performing well, and we have the ability to identify what those are going to be. But do you think we all approach this industry from too narrow a lens to see the big picture, and that big picture is actually not as rosy as we think it is?
Well, it seems like that's a prompt for one of us to take the other side of the coin here and argue that MFN is going to be the detriment of all of us. So yeah, look, I'll sound the word of caution on MFN at least. I hope I'm wrong, and I think the points that Paul and Yaron were making, that sentiment's already pretty poor, and more naturally has upside, not downside. But am I worried about MFN? I absolutely are. I mean, that the industry, sorry, this administration is going to take its pound of flesh out of drug pricing. I mean, that's a no-brainer. There's no way that Trump, despite his maybe threats and tantrums and then willingness to settle for something less, is still going to get something that he will settle for. There's no doubt that drug pricing will be impacted in a negative way by MFN. And to me, that does put us on a little bit of a slippery slope, much like the IRA did. I mean, we are still suffering from that legislation and the curtailment it put on long-term drug revenues. So, we're going to have to deal with that. I'm not saying it's going to be terrible, but there is something to be said about this populistic rise against our industry. It was crazy to me to see, Bernie Sanders and RFK Jr. This week mentioned in headlines as agreeing on direct-to-consumer advertising and hoping that is shut down. When you have the right and the left colluding almost on an issue that probably stirs up as much popular support as anything these days, our industry's on the defensive, and we better be careful, or else this could be more than just a pound of flesh. So, that's the worry.
Yeah. Why don't we move on to some of the regulatory and related, starting with UroGen. Bit of a somewhat surprise approval, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I guess yes and no, right? There's no doubt the drug UGN 102. What are they now calling it? Zervadice, or I can't even pronounce this word. Zusduri. There's no doubt it worked. It always was viewed as an efficacious drug. They didn't do a great phase 3 trial design. There was no control arm of substance in that design. So that got them in some trouble at ODAC last month. And I think, as many of our listeners know, the ODAC panel vote went against them 5-4. So, that was a close vote, but it was unfavorable. And the FDA probably did what we all thought it should have done, which is turn around and approve the drug. This is for low-grade, intermediate risk NMIBC. Josh, you know the indication, I'm sure, better than anyone on this call. So feel free to chime in here. But they priced this drug at about $21,000 per dose. So could be as much as $100,000 plus per course of therapy. And we expect that Zusduri is going to go up against basically interventional procedures like TURBT surgery, and will probably be best suited for those patients who either are elderly and can't really tolerate surgery, or have a highly recurrent nature to their disease. So, it probably will do well in that subset. There are, I think, 59,000 total patients with low-grade intermediate risk NMIBC. So it's certainly a large market. And, hats off to the team at UroGen for persevering and getting this one over the goal line.
Thoughts on what it means more broadly about the FDA, as we're all kind of, to Paul's point, wondering, whether it's going to be rosy or gloomy.
Well, I'll let someone else opine on that. I'm not sure I have a strong view.
Well, I mean, at least from my perspective, it shows the FDA is continuing to be flexible, right? It was a narrowly negative AdCom, and so one might have thought that they would, again, from a very dogmatic perspective, just kind of said no, and highlighting some of the concerns that the reviewer had raised. But again, it in many ways feels like, for the most part, business as usual. Maybe where it's not business as usual is RFK Jr. tearing to shreds the ACIP committee and replacing them with a mishmash of, I guess, specialists I wouldn't necessarily have thought would belong on an ACIP committee. There's a psychiatrist, nutritionist, an ER specialist, an obs-gyn practitioner, some very noted vaccine skeptics. This one, I guess, in my mind, feels maybe different than that knee-jerk reaction many had when Doctors McCary and Prasad were announced as head of FDA and CBER, and I think that's those appointments are actually starting to look quite strong. Even though one might have looked at their track record and had some concerns, is there anyone who's optimistic that this new ACIP committee is going to really make sound, thoughtful decisions that are in the best interest of public health policy?
Seems like a disaster, doesn't it?
Kind of.
Like,
Yep.
I don't know
Thanks for calling it.
what's the bull case. I don't know. My wife and I are expecting a kid in 3 weeks. I'm hoping
Yeah.
that I'm hoping we can get
Congratulations.
some vaccines in the next couple of years. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm concerned. I'm concerned for the world. What do others think?
This is what comes to mind is trying to have a dessert menu full of pastries without a pastry chef. Like, people who make steak cannot make pastry. Like, vaccines are a very specific breed of therapeutics. This is not like a regular drug. So that's definitely concerning to me. And that some of them apparently have some ties to RFK relating to the Merck litigation. I don't know if I have the facts correctly, but that's kind of what I've been reading. That's also raising some concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I wanted to add is there does seem to be this increasing narrative out there around the FDA being in a good place, and Makary and Prasad, being pro-industry and pro-drug approvals, and exerting that flexibility we just talked about on UGN 102. But this is not okay, what's happening in vaccines. It's not okay to say, well, the FDA is functional, and then point to the disaster that's going on in our public health system around RFK's and Jr.'s agenda for tearing apart the vaccine world. So we need to be very mindful of this, Josh. And I think you're right to raise it as a big problem. And it sounds like it's only going to get worse before something happens to unfortunately stop it. And most likely that something is going to be a public health crisis.
Yeah, from what I've seen, that this one to me is the one most across the line, just or at least threatening to be. just given the potential impact if the committee really does start to unwind vaccine practices and not really appreciate the important nuances of herd immunity, immune compromised individuals, the what if scenario of, well, what if you got the infection and not the vaccine? I'm not sure obstetricians and ER docs and psychiatrists and nutritionists are really going to be the best people to weigh all those factors. But we will obviously see. Not much we can do about it other than raise our voices and our cumulative concern, and then hope that ultimately good sound decisions will be made. All right, maybe on to another topic. Again, is ultimately for the group to opine on. We're starting to see a continued amount of investor activism against boards. We've had 8R1 send a very interesting letter to the Keros board. Deep Track has obviously been battling Dynavax. I guess it kind of raises the question particularly in tough times, when companies have lost investor mandates. Are boards doing enough and meeting their fiduciary duty consistently? Are shareholders being too aggressive? Does any of this even matter? Paul, maybe we'll start with you and get your thoughts on.
I mean, I don't think these investors are being too aggressive at all. I mean, look at what happened with Third Harmonic, and look at the reaction, not just on the street to the stock, but also just the perception of that team and the discipline they've had. And I think those executives, again, I didn't cover that stock, my colleague Alex did, but my sense is those executives will have, welcome roles leading another startup because, they made the right decision. So I mean, I think there's a number. I don't want to pick out companies and on this, but I think we've seen a number of times, right, where a company goes public and they've got a lead asset that is 90+% of the valuation, and they got some earlier stage stuff that investors didn't really spend much time on. The lead asset fails, and they've got excess of capital, and they're going to ultimately spend that capital on projects that weren't really the premise of them getting the money in the first place. And look, that's their right? If they have the money, and that's their right. But understanding that every situation is nuanced, I can totally understand why some investors are making pushes in certain situations like this. I have no problem with it.
Yaron, how about you?
Yeah, I've actually been speaking with a few people who are involved in these situations, and kind of, what we're hearing is that, and Eric, please chime in. You're sort of fresh off the company. Some boards are a little concerned that if they unwind the company, are they going to kind of admit defeat, and they're going to open themselves up for litigation? While we all think they have, let's say, 100 million on the balance sheet, they have commitments that they need to unwind, contracts with employees, facilities. They do need to keep some D&O insurance and insurance in case of litigation. So the 100 million is never 100 million. But I do believe that companies should make decisions faster to terminate programs. It's okay. We all know most programs won't work. They need to be equally skeptical on what they have, even if it means that the alternative is to shut down. And they need to be better stewards of capital. It's going to be much better for the industry, and we can use those shells then to take the next slew of companies out, given the lack of an IPO market. So I think it's the right direction.
Eric?
Yeah, I guess I just want to point out how amazingly quick this trend has occurred. Josh, you remember you and I were writing about zombie biotech companies just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I think it was maybe a note that we published back in February, and we were calling out many of the companies that were trading at well below their cash balance, who had these recent blowups that Paul mentioned, and were, still kind of willing to spend their inheritance on projects that investors hadn't really supported with the funds that they were giving those companies. And this was not happening 6 months ago. No one saw any of this happening. And now, today, it's almost commonplace. It's almost fait accompli that when a company has its main project blow up and it's got $300, $400, $500 million of cash, the company, as Third Harmonic does, either waves the white flag and says, okay, we're going to return capital, or where someone scoops in and tends to do it for them. So I do find this to be efficient capitalism. I think we had way too much capital held out into these shells of companies that no investors were supporting. And I honestly love the trend.
Eric, since you were in a company, and I guess your own too, like if you guys were in one of these situations where you're trading at a negative enterprise value, the lead drug failed, but you have a second clinical stage asset, and like you as the CFO, like you truly believe in it, but Wall Street doesn't. Like, what do you do? Like, do you go with your belief, or do you listen to investors who probably, when you're on the inside, you probably feel like they know a lot less than you do?
Yaron, you want to try?
I mean, I think it's look, the company that I was in, but I kind of left before a lot of the data read out, so I can't tell you what it was like to maybe be at that seat in general in any company during when data's out type thing. And I think it really depends on factors. What's the level of real support and conviction around the table in that asset, and also at the board, and you could see that in some cases. It we have to remember that these people then have to go find another job. So there are situations where the people around the table have already been successful and they're very employable, and it's easier for them to make the decision. They'll find another role. The people who've been less successful have probably other considerations. If there's mixed feelings around the table and the chances for success, then where's the power of balance and what is the tempo of the board? If everybody doesn't believe in the second asset, then it'd be a much easier decision. But it's complicated.
Well, and I think the onus is on the company, right, to prove to the world or to convince the world that any asset, whether it's the first asset, the second asset, or the third asset that you're willing to spend shareholder resources on, that asset will give you a reasonable return, right? I think the problem we've had is that there are too many companies trading well below their cash balance who failed at convincing the investment public that what they were doing made a lot of sense. Some are still failing at convincing the investment public that what they're doing makes a lot of sense. And we can blame that on a downturn in the market. We can say the market's inefficient, but to me, that's a slippery slope. Josh, I know I'm going to engage you in this debate, but saying that it's just a bear market and investors aren't listening, and investors are the ones tuning out all this great science, and they're the ones that need to change. I think that's a tough place for a management team to hide.
Yes and no, right? I mean, I think the markets have proven themselves time and time again to be inefficient, and a little market inefficiency is, not a big deal. Maybe costs a little bit more dilution, but we often see market inefficiencies that are far more profound and disruptive to companies. I think at the end of the day, one of the big challenges here is so much of this is subjective, right? The probabilistic analysis that we do to predict likelihood of a drug succeeding is as much an art as a science, and so it is entirely plausible that management teams and boards, especially with more information than investors who, not infrequently think they know more than they do, will have a very different sense of probability. And then who do you defer to in that case? And do you defer to a single agitating shareholder, even if a powerful one, or do you fight back, or ultimately do you wind up compromising? So certainly seems like something that is increasingly of importance in our industry, in part an industry that has struggled, in part an industry that wants some of that capital back in order to redeploy it and or simply correct some valuation discrepancies of these very negative enterprise value companies, and trying to generate at least some immediate return on the capital. All right, maybe on to another topic, an emerging theme that we were going to talk about when I was on a couple of weeks ago, but got pulled off. And that is the topic of psychedelics. And Paul, I know this is a space that you're quite interested in. We do have some upcoming data for Compass. How are you feeling about the Compass program and psilocybin in treatment-resistant depression, and then perhaps more broadly the psychedelic field in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a space I've become so much more excited about. And if you played me a recording of that statement, like when Compass was going public, I might have not believed it because the space has come a tremendously long way, right? If you go back to when Compass went public, which look, it was a promising story. There were a number of academic studies around psilocybin. There were still just an enormous amount of questions in this area, right? One being the FDA regulatory hurdle and what they're going to want for safety and trial design. Two, are these products even commercially viable? And three, this isn't a Compass comment, but more of a whole space comment. I think most of the companies in the kind of first wave of this space, right, were led by very untraditional management teams, which sometimes can be okay, but oftentimes management teams, or at least in certain cases, that had less drug development expertise, but they're trying to pioneer programs that are probably more complicated than average, right? So that's where we were. I think where we've gotten to, and I think what's made me a lot more positive on this area is really first the success of Spravato commercially. That's Johnson and Johnson's esketamine drug. It's not an easy drug to use. It's 2 hours inpatient. It's given every other week. The efficacy is not amazing. Not saying it doesn't help a lot of people, but it only worked in 2 out of 4 of its clinical trials, right? So it's not an amazing drug, and yet it's selling well over $1 billion, and it's growing fast, right? Like I think that could ultimately be a $3+ billion drug. And so for a company like Compass, or companies like GH or MindMed or ATI has a 5-MeO DMT study reading out this year too. I mean, it feels like the market has been validated. It feels like the FDA has become a lot more on board with this space with the approval of Spravato, and also with a number of these companies having pretty rigorous regulatory discussions around things like trial design and functional unblinding. And so, I think ultimately the bottom line is psychedelics feel like they're going to be a real commercial drug class, right? They're going to be premium priced products that are used predominantly in treatment resistant depression or anxiety. And, you could be looking at something that is a $5+ billion class. I don't think that's crazy. As it relates to Compass, I mean, the setup around their phase 3 study is nuanced because I think for that stock, the investment debate does continue to center more around the commercial setup versus whether the drug works. So for context, they're going to have their phase 3 data likely this month, from their first of 2 phase 3 trials for Comp 360, which is their psilocybin compound. This study is placebo controlled, and as a result, it's generally expected to succeed. Not just because the drug works, but also because in any placebo controlled study of a psychedelic, you have some level of functional unblinding. We're also going to get more limited disclosure at the top line because they want to preserve the integrity of their second phase 3, which the control arm is not a placebo, but a subtherapeutic dose. And so, I think as an investor or as an analyst covering Compass, right? I mean, I'm bullish into the data because I think the data are going to be positive, and I'm confident in that. But I think, ultimately you have to be realistic that the investment debate here is more around how this is given, 8 hours in a center. They have a trained therapist with the patient at most sites in these studies. It seems plausible that that's not going to be a requirement in the real world. So certain things there, I think, are kind of the longer term investment debates that aren't going to be resolved by these data. But the context is this space felt, a little science project-y a half decade ago, and now it feels like there's a number of real companies, and it should be taken seriously.
Any
What do you think, Tim?
any guesses on the magnitude of MADRS benefit in the Compass trial?
It's a good question, man. So, for context, again, like they are going to only be disclosing the placebo adjusted effect on MADRS, right? And I think what we've seen across these psychedelic studies specifically is the magnitude of placebo response is just like enormously variable, right? Like in some of the Spravato studies, even though there was quote unquote functional unblinding, you still saw a healthy benefit on the placebo patients, right? And that benefit might just be from participating in a trial, coming into a clinical center, some level of spontaneous resolution. You contrast that with the GH phase 2 study, where the placebo arm didn't improve at all, right? And that could be due to a variety of factors, right? One also potentially being functional unblinding to some degree. So for psilocybin, you should have functional unblinding, which should attenuate placebo response. But the experience for the patient, even the person on placebo, is potentially like more involved, right? And you might get some therapeutic benefit from being at the center and being in the room and all the interactions and stuff like that. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is like they could put up, Josh, a 4 to 5 point difference between drug and placebo in the top line. And some could say, oh no, that's half the effect size of 5-MeO-DMT in the GH study. And what I would say is, well, we have to see what placebo did before we can really interpret that. But I think like in that ballpark, that 4 to 5 point range, I mean, that's kind of a likely base case for me if this works, that or better. Just because I do think ultimately this probably will have a below average placebo response as far as MDD studies go. And, I'm fairly confident that the drug works. And so, I think mid to high single digits is probably like the right range. But again, there's a lot of nuance, and we're not going to know some of the key details to really making that cross trial comparison when the press release comes out.
Yeah, I think it's a great summary. One of the early questions as well was, who's going to figure out how to deliver this, right? You think of most psychiatrist offices, it's a room to see a patient in a waiting room. Where on earth are you going to find a room or suite of rooms to deliver this care to patients? And all along, Compass kind of said, "Oh, it's building itself. It's building itself." And lo and behold, it's absolutely building itself. I am literally looking out my window across the street at what used to be a convenience store, and now it's an interventional psychiatry behavioral health clinic, right? And like,
That's crazy, man.
it's like,
Is that right?
it's like, what on earth's going on here? But I think it reflects the fact that psychiatrists, I think, realize that they've partly been practicing pseudo medicine because they just haven't really had anything meaningful to offer these patients outside of some modestly efficacious medications that also have some pretty significant side effects, maybe not life-threatening side effects, but certainly um, life-altering side effects. And so now that they have within their grasp something to provide patients to really transform their lives, why wouldn't you adapt your practice and clinic and kind of figure out a way how you can deliver these a little bit more intensive type monitoring therapies, but with ideally the benefit of just really transforming lives in ways that they really do aspire to. So yeah, very much looking forward to the Compass data and a stream of catalysts. Like, a lot of this has been in the works for some time, and now we are starting to see the late stage clinical trials reading out. To your point about Spravato, a therapy that's not the easiest to administer because you got to keep going back and to the office to weekly or every other week basis, the time to administer it, the travel time, the travel costs, and yet it's grown like a weed. So
It's amazing,
yeah,
man. It's really amazing. I mean, I think the last thing is just, a lot of these centers figured out how to turn this into a business. Like
yeah,
that clinic across the street from you, or even, Mass General Hospital, right? Which Mass General, if anyone's ever been in MGH, it's so big and, has so many different groups. It almost feels like being in an airport in that lobby. And yet they figured out, how to turn Spravato, as I understand it, like into a revenue driver, right?
yep,
And that's going to have to play out with all of these individually. And there's some concern that with the longer duration psychedelics, that you might not be able to flow as many patients through the center in a day, but it's actually unclear if that's really going to impact the economics. And so, without going down that rabbit hole, I mean,
yeah,
the money piece of it always helps.
yep, indeed. All right, let's move on to some of the other important news of the week, starting with Avidity. Eric, what do we learn about FSHD and their regulatory path?
Yeah, kind of a multifaceted update from the folks at Avidity on their Delbrax for fasculosculpular humoral dystrophy, FSHD. This is obviously a disease that has no approved therapies and is quite progressive. So lots of unmet medical need here. I guess what we heard was, number one, that the FDA is open to a potential accelerated approval pathway, though maybe there's still some work that needs to be done there. Number two, that the company has started its confirmatory phase 3 study, an outcomes-based study. And number three, that the phase 1/2 data, extended data set, including longer term follow-up, looked really good. The street seemed to focus on number one, maybe not getting quite what it wanted from the accelerated approval discussion that the company has had with the FDA at this point in time. Clearly, the FDA is open to accelerated approval, but I think the company's still kind of working out some of the supportive data sets that it needs to file on a DUX4 biomarker endpoint. And I expect they'll get there, and I expect that when they do file late next year for accelerated approval, the drug's going to be approved. But what I think may be missed by Wall Street investors, with the stock having been down this week, was the really consistent data that we saw in terms of clinical and, for that matter, biomarker outcomes from the phase 1/2 study. I was very impressed. This is a slowly progressive disease, a disease that can move down stochastically, sort of randomly, and to in a relatively small cohort of patients, 35, 40 patients over the course of 12 months, to be able to see that consistency across multiple different physician and patient reported clinical benchmarks of disease and also biomarker objective benchmarks of disease. I mean, that just tells me this thing works. So to me, our probability of success for this drug should go up, meaningfully higher as an investment community. And we just haven't seen that price into the stock. But Paul or Josh, I know you guys know this one well too, so chime in.
It just feels like, again, like we said earlier, right? I mean, this is one of a number of catalysts that we've gotten in the past month or two, and obviously in the 6 months before that, when in the Peter Marks days, right, where we're getting regulatory alignment with a degree of flexibility. I mean, total, CBER, not CEDAR, right? But we saw, uniQure's alignment in Huntington's recently. And this one is one I've been watching closely for, not just for avidity in this FSHD program, which could be a really big drug if it works out, but also for just the DM1 space, because there's an odd, sort of atypical scenario there with avidity pursuing this full approval path and Dyne pursuing an accelerated approval path on a DMPK biomarker with clinical data. And, it feels like the receptivity here probably has some positive read through to the potential receptivity there, and we should know soon.
Josh, do we lose you?
You did. I was talking to myself on mute. So I was just moving on to the Insmed data update. Big week for that company, and Will Lewis, the CEO, is on quite the run. The data for their TPIP inhaled prostacyclin analog for pulmonary hypertension looking quite good. Delivered as a once-a-day administration, in contrast to United Therapeutics' blockbuster Tyvaso, which is 3 times a day. Let's see if anyone knows a little bit of history on this one, because if you recall, Tyvaso is a 3 times a day inhaled prostacyclin. At one point was competing with another company that I think was delivering inhaled iloprost 4 times a day or more. Anyone remember what that drug was and what the company developing it was? No, crickets. It was Cotherix's Ventavis, and just perhaps a reminder that, for these inhaled therapies that can take, up to 10 minutes for each session to inhale, the ability to reduce the number of times that a patient has to do that can be very powerful in terms of claiming market share. What was also interesting about Insmed now, this is getting to be a pretty large company. It's close to 20 billion market cap, and Adam Feuerstein from Stat was kind of commenting on that, wondering, is the company just too big to be acquired? And then is that a bad thing or a good thing for biotech? Are we ever going to stop talking about pharma M&A as an important driver of stock performance, and maybe start getting behind these companies that might ultimately kind of become perhaps the next Regenerons or even bigger? Anyone have any thoughts as to why we are so M&A obsessed as opposed to large company building obsessed?
Yeah, I agree with you. We need Vertex, Regeneron, Celgene, Alnylam, right? Argenx. the companies these companies all had one thing in common, right? They had a sizable first product that then allowed them to develop a pipeline underneath and become a large cap. So I think the obsession might be warranted for the smaller companies that really need a bigger partner. But for those who can really make it on their own, I'd say, fly the Armada and sail across the ocean. Acceleron to me was one that I still believe he was ashamed that he was acquired. Again, no offense to Merck, but I think they would have done fantastically on their own. Um, we probably need both, is kind of the way I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and
It,
I would say the more we have larger biopharma companies, in theory, the more acquisitive they will be, perhaps, of the companies that don't necessarily have the type of assets or portfolios to turn into a very large acquirer on their own. Sorry, Paul, what were you gonna say?
well, yeah, I mean, I think the interesting M&A piece, and you guys, I'd love your perspective on this too, is just that like it feels like investors they don't like stocks in this space are not really valued on DCF. Like they are, but they aren't, right? It's almost like I feel like as a sell side analyst I have to have one, but I also know that when I talk to people about valuation, it can be a little bit hand wavier, right? Peak sales multiple, comps, things like that. And so I think in the context of that, like, the possibility of M&A, even if that possibility is like a couple percent, it almost just helps put a company into a different valuation conversation, right? And Josh, you and I think Yaron actually too, and Eric, you might have even covered this at one point when you were at Cowen, like Ionis, right? Ionis has built like a pretty impressive company. They've got a number of programs, they've got a number of shots on goal. It feels like because that company is seen as an extremely low likelihood M&A target, that it's not going to get that valuation premium that many people hope it should. And so, right or wrong, I feel like it's not just about investors feeling like they need an exit. It's also just feeling like for biotech, for the risk that you take on, you almost need a couple percent chance of that dream case at least to sort of justify everything else. That's my gut feeling.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, how ironic that Ionis is the one company that binds us all together.
That is awesome.
Well, Ionis, we all wait for the next 12 to 18 months where the golden age of Ionis is coming. Well, we have another 18 months window now.
I mean, they got a lot going on, man. They got a lot going on. Like they're smart drug developers, but it's fascinating how the psychology of these things can be an overhang for a very long time.
I mean, Paul's comment is so interesting, right? We build these DCF analyses and think that, that's the right way to value really any company. And then we throw out the towel because it doesn't seem like companies actually trade around DCF fundamentals. So there seems something a little wrong or off about that. If a company is not worth the cash that it can likely generate, um, akin to almost any company in any other industry and how they're valued, shouldn't they be? What's a reason to not?
Look, what I don't know if you can hear me. What I struggle with a DCF is that everybody does a DCF in a different way, and so much of it is the long-term value. I don't even know how people look at working capital, right? Because that should be a part of the DCF. And of course, what we all use as a discount rate is highly sensitive. Then really what we think apply the future cash flows and forget about CapEx. It just, there's so much subjectivity that I think DCFs are challenging. I think in some ways, if you think about it, if you're trying to model a financial company, a bank, how do you possibly figure out what is their earnings going to be in 5 years? Impossible, I would argue. At least with biotech, you can figure out what the 5-year outlook looks like, and then you can apply multiple based on growth. So I tend to think that a PE is a better way to do it. We do DCFs, but I just don't have a huge amount of confidence in them. That's just kind of our view.
Eric, what's your approach?
Well, I guess, as you know, Josh, for these development stage companies at least, I think valuation is a fool's game. I agree with your own. It's kind of garbage in, garbage out. What really, really, really matters is whether the drug works or not, right? And that's a black or white outcome. Drugs either work and they're probably worth more money than their weight in gold and will grow and grow and grow and succeed and change medicine and benefit patients, or they don't and they're zeros. So we should spend a lot less time as a community working out models that are fictitious and a lot more time doing due diligence on what's going to work.
All right, maybe next topic, Yaron, do you want to take us through the Ascendis coach data?
Yeah, and chime in too, Josh. You're an expert here. So this is for the audience. This is Ascendis tested their TransCon CNP. That's their drug just filed for achondroplasia PDUFA on November 30, and uniquely they decided to also bridge it, marry it to their own growth hormone. Growth hormone is not the standard of care for patients with achondroplasia. Because as you know, they have an FGFR issue in their bone. Their bones are not normal. So if you give them growth hormone, they benefit, but they're not fixing the underlying issue. So they said, why don't we put them together? There was no control, so we had to look at historical controls, and everybody came off their TransCon CNP alone. And the data was very provocative. 21 patients, they showed essentially an increase in the annual growth trajectory and also the body proportionality, because many people know achondroplasia have normal body proportionality. So the data was very intriguing. It looks better than TransCon alone in pass or Voxzogo from BioMarin. BridgeBio has an oral FGFR, pan-FGFR drug, which looks really, really good. We're waiting for the phase 3 data late this year. But frankly, the combination now looks even better than that. And it looks like even on body proportionality, the data continues to get better. We only, by the way, are looking at 26 weeks now, and that data already looks as good as the 52-week data from the previous therapies. So the next step is to do a phase 3. They're going to do CNP alone plus or minus growth hormone. They're not going to test growth hormone alone because that's obviously not approved there. The big question is going to be ultimately is, as we all know, patients who have short stature, they're kids, they're only usually on 2 years, not on it chronically for life. And so naturally the question is going to be, should a patient be on growth hormone with CNP for a year? Is it chronic? There is some data out there historically that suggests that patients typically benefit for 1 year on growth hormone with achondroplasia, and then they don't lose the benefit, but 2 years onwards, they don't really benefit further. So it's going to be a 1-year study, but it will be interesting to see whether FDA is going to say, hey, just like remember for Voxzogo, FDA said, we really want to see your 2-year data to get you approved. That was the first CNP replacement, and whether FDA is going to want 2-year data here too. I don't know.
Well, in
What do you
your
think,
own,
Josh?
it's interesting because my impression was that the BioMarin 2-year data stems from the historical issues where growth hormone in this disease might have a short-term benefit, but tolerate out over time. Isn't that right?
That is totally correct. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What do you guys like? I actually have a question because I cover Balmarin and it's been such a tough story and it's like stuck in like a Alexion like universe of the undisprovable bear case with Ascendis and the pipelines lacking and all this kind of stuff. Like how do you guys think about the Ascendis launch? Because I feel like there's really two credible sides of it. The one side is just, hey, we've got a once weekly drug that maybe is clinically better, maybe not. Like, why would anyone take a once daily drug? And then on the other hand, like you look at like even the growth hormone space, right? With how the once weeklies originally launched, you look at like hemophilia with long actings, and then you think about just the global nature of this achondroplasia market, and you could also, I think, make a pretty strong case that BioMarin might be much more resilient than people think. And I only cover BioMarin, I don't cover Ascendis, but I get the sense from the investor community that this is a super polarizing topic, and would love to hear your guys' perspective.
And it seems like a common theme that we encounter in biotech, right? When you have an incumbent, entrenched player, and there's something shiny and new coming along that maybe investors and even the physician community is enthusiastic about, and everyone's nervous and very paranoid that the entrenched player is going to rapidly lose market share, and oftentimes they don't for various reasons, but then sometimes they do. And so how on earth do you really kind of know when that entrenched player has some stickiness versus not, aside from just trying to do a lot of diligence? I guess in this case, at least for the checks that we have done for this patient population with specialists, we hear not that much enthusiasm. They're a little nonplussed for Voxzogo because they lament that it's a daily injection, and it's a daily injection for kids who don't want any injections, nor do parents ever want to have to inject their kid with a needle. I think that goes without saying. And on top of that, they're a little underwhelmed with the efficacy that they're seeing with Voxzogo. And so, when we did the checks, we certainly picked up a high degree of enthusiasm for Bridges and figratinib, assuming that it stays safe and competitive on its efficacy profile as an oral option for kids. And I think anyone who's ever had to inject themselves with a needle probably realizes that it's not. I mean, if you have to, you do it. That's fine. Like, probably better than having a disease go untreated. But if you could have a pill instead, in many cases, that actually, from a patient perspective, would be preferable. And then you just magnify that quite substantially when it comes to kids, of course, who would certainly prefer a pill to a needle. So, our checks do suggest that Voxzogo does have vulnerability, and that's probably why, Paul, you point out that that's been an overhang on the stock. Is it possible that this becomes a setting where BioMarin can kind of defend its territory by highlighting long-term safety data, et cetera? It's nothing's ever absolute. And I think one of the things we struggle with the most is when it comes time to predicting not just the size of a market, but how it's going to split among different agents, and how introduction of new options into a field can potentially expand the field by bringing more patients onto therapy with or without necessarily cannibalizing others that are already there. But I think from our view, again, very positive feedback that we've heard on infigratinib, primarily because the docs that we've spoken to like the profile, the efficacy, the tolerability, and very much appreciate it being an oral option. I'm not sure if you've heard something different or.
Yeah, totally. That's the drug that we've been. So our colleague Tyler, as you know, excuse me, cover Bridge, and we've been following that program through Ascendis, thinking that could be the winner. What's interesting is that they're going to have data late this year, as you know, so they're going to be on the market, I don't know, late next year. Oral option could be really great for new patients. I guess the question is, do you switch? We think BioMarin is obviously going to lose share. And then the question is going to be, what do you do when the CNP Skytrofa data shows up? And does that change things again as two weeklies that they say they can co-formulate? So that'll be interesting. And then, of course, there's hypochondroplasia and all the other indications, right? BioMarin is talking about $1 billion going to $5 billion. So that's good for everybody.
Right. And
Well, it's just crazy that BioMarin gave long-term guidance a couple weeks before this Ascendis data, right? I mean, that's like I know they talk about how they've incorporated competition and they've gone back and done the work, but it's tough timing, tough luck for them.
Yeah, agreed. All right,
Well, maybe at another point, Paul, would love to hear your thoughts about can BioMarin block Ascendis through the International Trade Court, a la right Roche and Mercera, Amgen and Mercera from Roche?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, there's two. So obviously, I have no idea. I feel like IP stuff is so hard. I mean, look, the Ascendis challenged the BioMarin patent in Europe, and that patent was the key patent was narrowed, but there's still claims, right, that have kind of an argument probably on both sides as to whether Ascendis infringes it. I mean, we've done some patent calls and they've said, hey, like, BioMarin's got a real case here, but it's always so hard to handicap. I mean, I feel like for BioMarin stock, it certainly doesn't give option value to the scenario, but blocking is really, really hard. In the US, I mean, one nuance here, and again, I know maybe we want to cover other topics, but like, I just think this is so interesting. I guess since you guys cover Ascendis, is I was really surprised that Ascendis got priority review, because again, going back to your comment, Yaron, we've been talking about whether Ascendis is going to need the 2-year data for approval, and instead they get priority review. And to me, that suggests that the FDA is not looking at that as merely a convenience product, right? And so, I mean, that could also feed into this IP piece as well. Like, if Ascendis can make, and they're going to make their argument about their own data, but if they can actually make a regulatory based argument that it's not just a me too, that probably makes it, more challenging for BioMarin to block them. Did you guys think anything of that priority review?
That was definitely definitely interesting. That definitely caught my eye. I got to tell you, we immediately thought that BioMarin has now kind of set a new precedent that FDA is comfortable with this mechanism and that they're not going to require 2-year data. But you bring up a good point. The priority review might be another angle.
Yeah.
I think we're final minutes here. I do want to touch on some of the EULAR updates, in particular Cabaletta Bio's CAR T for myositis, scleroderma, and lupus and lupus nephritis that have a very strong showing at EULAR. This is one of those scenarios, maybe not unlike the psychedelic field, where it feels like the buzz in the patient and physician community is far, far greater than the buzz in the investment community. Anyone with any thoughts as to why that may be the case in this context now for the CAR T field, which is, it's not been the smoothest ride, but it does seem to be kind of leveling out now in a way that does appear poised to deliver meaningful value to patients. Eric, I know this is a field that you've kind of kept an eye on. Any
Well, I
thoughts
mean,
on
I guess, look, I'm a big fan of what Steve and his team are trying to do at Cabaletta, as are you, right? And I believe that they're showing something that's never been seen before in these very, very severe and difficult to treat patients with all sorts of rheumatologic disorders. So good for them for fighting this charge. I also understand, to some extent at least, why investors are not yet on board, and it's because of the capital issue, right? I mean, we just saw the company take in, unfortunately, it was forced probably to take in, but take in $100 million at a fairly low valuation, and that's going to, be very dilutive for their future shareholders. So that's the mindset we're in right now with Wall Street. Maybe this is a short-term inefficient market, as we were talking earlier today. Maybe we should have more enthusiasm, but it's a little bit like a vicious cycle right now for all these cell therapy companies, knowing that they're going to need to spend in manufacturing, they're going to need to spend in expensive studies, maybe not large studies, but still expensive studies, to get to those milestones and to get closer to market where they can start to make money. That's my only consideration. But Yaron, I don't know if you have different thoughts.
No, I agree. I mean, this is still early, right? But 7 out of 8 responses across several types of myositis was definitely very encouraging. They're working through the kinks. These are refractory patients. Um, that market this is going to be a growth market. There's a lot of innovation there with the FcRns. There's a interferon beta antibody. There's upcoming phase 3 from brepocitinib from Roivant, from Matt Gline, our colleague on the show, who's a featured, routinely. That data is potentially coming in September. So patients are going to start having a lot of innovation. And CAR T is going to be a great option, for those who are pretty refractory. And that data is definitely encouraging. And again, kudos to Steve. I know it's been not been easy, and he's been doing a nice job shepherding through.
I trained in rheumatology and can certainly attest to the unmet need in myositis. And then probably one of the absolute biggest needs in rheumatology and just in general that, one of those indications investors for whatever reason just haven't given the time of day is scleroderma, systemic sclerosis. That can be a very, very, very troubling disease with high morbidity and mortality. Some of the early data coming out of the CAR T experience is very promising. Now, one of the things that I always find interesting is trying to find, those potential sleeper programs where, maybe there is some early exciting proof of concept, and yet, investors are just preoccupied with other later stage programs and missing a big opportunity. Another one that comes to mind, actually, back to our conversation on psychedelics, is Compass and PTSD. No one ever talks about PTSD, Paul. I'm not sure if you have a view as to that unmet need and the potential role of psilocybin, but that data has been.
Yeah, I mean, look, it looks like it works, right? And there's also just a number of other studies in PTSD too that sort of support this reset effect of psychedelics. I mean, Compass has, I think investors just look at on paper what's the biggest market, right? I mean, depression is just so, it's so much bigger that I feel like if people feel like PTSD might just be sort of like more of the upside thing, but I'm with you, man.
Yeah, and similar to scleroderma and lupus, right? Like one of the indications does have a number of treatment options for patients to cycle through until they get to, new innovative therapies. Whereas scleroderma, PTSD, really nothing approved for them, and as such, perhaps